Hi, and welcome to Decoding AQ, helping you to learn the tools, mindsets, and actions to thrive in an ever-changing world. Hi, and welcome to another episode of Decoding AQ. With me today in her morning, my evening, I have VanTon-Quinlivan. She is Futuro Health CEO. She's the best-selling author of Workforce RX, and that's inclusive and agile strategies for employers, educators, and workers during unsettled times. She's also a distinguished podcast host and a former Executive Vice Chancellor of California Community Colleges. So welcome.
I'm delighted to be here with you and your listeners, Ross.
Thank you. Well, you are a nationally recognized thinker and doer, certainly in workforce development, and a catalyst for inclusive economic mobility through higher education. In fact, some of the numbers, reading through your bio and doing my internet stalking, which I try to do before all guests, some of them are really mind-blowing, and a distinguished career that spans private, public, and nonprofit sectors. And currently the CEO, as I mentioned, of Futuro Health, whose a nonprofit mission is to improve the health and wealth of communities by growing the largest network of credentialed allied healthcare workers in the nation. And just going back maybe a decade, you were named White House Champion of Change under the Obama administration in recognition of your career and industry work in education and service as a community leader. And in fact, I want to take you back a little bit, maybe to that moment with my first sort of question for you, Van, which was, what was the most challenging part of managing $1 billion in public investment in programs across California's 115 community colleges? So it was the largest and most complex higher education system in the nation at the time. I'm sure it probably still is. But what was the hardest bit in managing something so big, so vast, so complex, and so large, Van?
Well, Ross, this is a good one for the case studies. When I started as the governor appointee to drive the workforce mission of the California Community Colleges, which, as you said, is the largest system of higher education in the nation with 116 institutions, I wasn't managing a budget of $1 billion. Actually, it was the worst of times, and the discretionary budget that I had was only $100 million. Some of the line items had been cut, and some line items had been cut as severely as 50%. So there was a loss of confidence, especially in a down economy, much like what we're in right now. So when I came on board, all I wanted to do was to have, better workforce outcome, get more students to land successfully in the world of work, but there was no money, right? So no new money to play with to be able to do new programming. So what did I do? I mean, I relied on my kind of the fundamentals of business, which is how do you stretch the dollars that you have? And so I began asking the questions of, well, why is it colleges, these are expensive workforce programs, why don't we coordinate amongst the colleges better so that more students can get what they need in order to get out successfully in the workforce? So, just core questions you would ask, like the why questions. I'm going to kind of fast forward. What eventually happened was that we were able to take workforce from being an afterthought to actually becoming a policy priority, and monies flow in the direction of what is priority. So my division went from 100 million to 200 million to 700 million to over $1 billion under my 2 terms. But it wasn't just the money. In order to build the public confidence that we were going to do the right things, you actually need to make sure that the monies, the metrics, and the data all align so that the 116 institutions have the wind in their sail, and then you remove some of the anchors that were holding them back from doing what was needed. So anyway, that's the story of the change management, and I'm sure, just like many of your other guests, there's a lot of details under there about what it takes to be the change agent.
I guess, one of the challenges, I remember a quote actually by my coach, Dan. I'm not sure where it originated from, but it was this difference between, well, if you've got the money and you've got a check to write it, you've just got a project. you haven't got a problem. If you haven't got the money, then you've got, you know, the need for creativity, the need for innovation, the need for something. And often that necessity brings out, like you mentioned, those why questions, digging in to really try and align both maximum impact, but also you mentioned something really quite telling: money flows with priorities. And so I'm interested to perhaps dig a little bit into there with your sort of background in marketing, then getting into workforce development. How much of it was storytelling and the narrative to align those things to get, as you mentioned, the wind in the sails, to do this combination of efficiency through collaborations, but also getting the alignment of priorities? Was it you fed in with the priorities, or you rechanged what the priorities were through influence? What was the sort of story there?
So Ross, maybe this is I borrowed some techniques because when I was in the private sector, I saw a lot of, and I was part of a lot of change management initiatives. And so I combined a number of those strategies together when it came to the being in the public seat of the executive vice chancellor. And it's a system where it's all influence. It's not direct authority, which is super challenging, right? None of the presidents or the heads of the deans of these institutions worked directly for me. I could not hire and fire, nor could my chancellor. So how do you create the circles of influence, the cascades of influence, especially in the worst of times when you don't have much money? So, you know, let me talk a little bit about the red team that I pulled together. So you know, as all of your leaders, I went around finding out who are, you know, the informal leaders as well as formal leaders, and listening to what they said. And the large part, they would say that, you know, we work really hard, we do really good things, but we're just under-recognized, and therefore we're underfunded, right? You know, we're not valued the way that we ought to be valued. And then I went to the folks who controlled our purse strings, which are, you know, everybody from the governor's office to the Department of Finance to the legislature, you know, the Senate side, the Assembly side, big stakeholders like the Chamber of Commerce, for example. And I listened to them, and I came up with 3 pages of criticism of our system in fine print. So then what I decided to do was to bring not only my internal leadership team, they're called deans. I mean, they may be the equivalent of directors in companies. And then those who are formal, kind of formal leaders and informal leaders, and created what I called a red team. And I just shared with the red team, this is what they're saying about us, right? These are the criticisms about us. And so, you know, for 2 meetings, we all stared at each other, and everybody said, well, I am doing everything right. And it's that it's that group of people. So everybody was pointing, it's everybody else's fault and it's not mine. So by the 3rd meeting, we finally kind of broke the ice, where someone, one of the informal leaders said, okay, if this is what they're saying, let's say it's true. What does that mean? And so the group began engaging in, you know, really serious conversation about how else it could be. And really within the, you know, the 3 to 6 month time frame, I had all the component pieces of what people wanted to do. And, you know, Ross, one of the things I've noticed, like in the, you know, I've taken work from like local activity to national renown several times in a row. And it's barely because it's the most brilliant idea. It's ideas that people have had in their head. Different people have had components of it, but they can't figure out how to really launch it and make it real. Right. So all of these ideas, that wishes and wants of this red team, you know, were surfaced. And then what I did was I gave it a name, and that name became Doing What Matters for Jobs and the Economy. That became my campaign name. And under Doing What Matters for Jobs and the Economy, there were really four tranches of activities that we needed to do in order to kind of unlock our potential, but to reposition the system so that it was visible to policymakers and the broader communities that, that made a difference in our funding. And maybe the last thing I'll say is, over the 6 years, I never deviated from that playbook. We couldn't do everything at once. There were sequences that were important, but all the actions were with intentionality, and we stayed the course. And it does take that kind of leadership to stay the course. Otherwise, the field of 116 institutions who all have their own governance, they can get confused easily, right? Or distracted easily. So that intentionality really just helps sets the breadcrumb for what it is that you want to get done.
It's interesting you describe this, challenge of perceptions being reality. How do we then create and galvanize unity from cross-functional, fragmented elements? And a lot of that is simplification, good narrative, good framing, good story, and then sticking with that long enough as your filter from, shiny object. And I'm really intrigued by this, because in adaptability and our adaptability intelligence, when do we know it's right to stay the course, to have the grit, to, plant your feet in the ground? And when do you know, no, this has shifted, the environment shifted, there's something changed, I need to now go in flow with that rather than come up against it as friction? And how did you maintain that sort of decision making for that 6 years? Because I'm sure a lot changed in environment factors, a lot of policy factors, to stay steadfast to that unification and that narrative. How did you deal with some of that decision making? And maybe now, actually, I'll let you respond to that first, and then I'll take us into the next piece about Futuro as well, which I'd like to dive into.
Well, Ross, during my 2 terms, which is 8 years as executive vice chancellor, I actually had 3 chancellors. So the terms of the chancellor, I mean, these were tough jobs. And so, it's so easy that you could, with a new leader, you go change everything that you do, right? You just pivot. So the question was, where do you stay intentional, and where do you adapt? And I would have to say, what helped me a lot to know, to ground me, is really the why of what I did, right? So, when I was 6 years old in 1975, my family escaped from the Vietnam War. So it's not very different from the situation right now in Ukraine. And we came to the United States, and my parents had to start all over again. My father was a neurosurgeon, which, as you know, is like an alpha of doctors, and he had to restart residency. My mother was a teacher, which was a very venerable position in Vietnam, and she restarted here as a bookkeeper in order to make a living for us. And so I've always been super appreciative that I had opportunity here, which would be a dramatic difference from what it would have been like had I not been able to get out of Vietnam. And so I feel that the work I do is about, unlocking and paying forward opportunity to the next person, right? So in my community college role in Futuro Health, it's all about unlocking that opportunity. So when I think about, what it takes to get somebody to the starting line, all the system stuff that is got nothing to do with them, that is in the way, all sorts of processes, all, whatever the drama is, the work is to get rid of all of that. So it's just the individual and their horsepower that is tapping into that opportunity. And so I've noticed that it's my superpower. When I touch the space of unlocking opportunity, especially opportunity in higher education, I am bold, I am fierce, I'll challenge bureaucracy, I'll take on extraordinary complex discussions that give me headaches, to work it through to get to a solution, create unusual allies, so that we can tackle these big issues together. And then I've noticed that when I'm not touching this space, then I just become, regular Van. So it's really interesting what is unlocked when we are touching sort of the core of our passion.
I think it comes to your quite clever use of, doing what matters. And if that can be uniquely aligned to an individual, we can then all be within our flow, within our unique ability, within our superpower. And therefore it gives us the filter of, what am I willing to, put up with and tolerate and go for, sleepless nights, or shift and change things in the expansion and pursuit of something that matters to me, that I care about. And if we rally people around us that are aligned to that same hierarchy of goal, all the other stuff that's in pencil, that shifts, that moves, if it's in service of that greater piece that people are passionate about, that they'll persevere, the definition of having grit, passion and perseverance, all the other stuff we can take on, any kind of setbacks, any resilience, we can have flexibility of how we approach it. So that's absolutely fascinating. I think that I even hear it in your energy flow, right? We're all just custodians of a period of time that we're here for, and the roles that we play. I love the way that you just described how this visualization of you just clearing the way, clearing the barriers for people to be in their own unique ability. So I'd like to transition to then, from that kind of role, what led you into a focus on the future of care education specifically, and tell us a little bit more about Futuro, what you're doing, and what your pathway into that was, Van. I'd be fascinated.
Well, sure, Ross, so you mentioned that I was in the private sector first and then the public sector and now nonprofit. So in the private sector, that was where I first got, stubbed my toe working in workforce development, because the energy sector, actually it was the energy, the gas and the nuclear sectors of the entire country was facing a seriously aging demographics. 25 to 50% of the workforce was going to be eligible for retirement within the next 10 years. So my company of 20,000 was no different. And I noticed as I was walking around the company, and I was in this fabulous role where I was right hand to the CEO of the company. So I got to sit and participate in all these meetings, and I would keep hearing from the field like, oh, we can't find good hires, and what they really struggled with was good hires who were diverse, right? So that the two words quality and diversity couldn't stand in the same line. The HR person also said, well, we'll do extra effort because we're going out into community organizations to even administer our pre-employment test. But at best, we're getting like 1 out of 30 passing the pre-employment test. And that's before the drug test and the background test, right? So they were trying, but they were having a miserable time. And I had actually looked at all these best practices from other industries, and I said, there's got to be a better way. And of course, being grounded in my own experience from coming from a diverse community, I knew that these jobs that the company had on the front lines, they were really good jobs. They started, maybe 60K, you can make 6 figures without having a 4-year degree. Communities would love to know about them, but it's just not on the radar. So I pitched to the CEO, I said, I'd like you to let me go. Here's my 1-page plan, and I'm going to show the company how else it can be done in order to create a diverse and quality and reliable workforce pipeline. Pitched it to him, pitched it to the SVP of HR, who was a brand new guy, and some others. And, each of these divisions like gave me a little bit of really just like 10K investment each and 2 staff. And so I went from the 29th floor where I had glass, in all 4 directions, a view of the Bay Bridge. And I went to the HR floor on the 2nd floor with not very much amenities, as you know. And I'll tell you, at a moment in time, I had one of those moments like, what have I done to myself? What if it doesn't work, right? Anyway, I was able to take the company from having no opinion in workforce development to being a nationally recognized best practice. And so I began collecting best practice just through trial and error there, to trial and error in the community colleges. And when I stepped off, one of the stakeholders who had worked with me, big hospital system, even their union colleague, they said, we've been wrestling with this idea, like, how do we deal with the workforce shortages, especially in allied health, which is about 65% of all of our allied healthcare workforce. They're the people who would show up if you had an accident, like the paramedic, the person who checks you in, the person who takes your x-rays. There's a world of technicians that are called allied healthcare workers, right? What would it take for you to become CEO and take all these ideas that we were wrestling for 2 years and make it real? And so I stepped up to the challenge because I wanted to bring all these best practices and create an out-of-the-box workforce solution that tackled this issue in 3 ways. I mean, one is we needed, we were dealing with 500,000 more workers. You can't solve that with 25 students at a time. What we wanted to do was do thousands at a time. So how do you build it for scale? And then secondly, always keep an eye on diversity, right? Always solve for that so that you're bringing in diverse communities into these healthcare jobs. And then lastly, agility. We were launched 3 months before the pandemic, and boom, all of a sudden skills changed, especially in healthcare, like moving to telehealth. And so you needed to design a system that would pivot as quickly as was needed in skills. And so just fast forward, Ross, we were able to do that, which is a very unique. When I was in the private sector previously, I was so proud of us because we were consistently getting in talent pools where we were 56, 57, 58% diverse. Futuro Health, in year 1, we achieved 80% diversity, year 2, 80% diversity, year 3, it went up to 90% diversity with 52% bilingual. So when you talk about healthcare and health equity, the key drivers is if you have a workforce that's ethnically diverse, linguistically diverse, and then of course all of the skills that are needed. But we're really proud that we're going to be able to sort of break the downward cycle that the whole country, but I mentioned I was at the World Health Organization speaking about this issue because all the countries are experiencing the same healthcare shortage, right? And so, being able to create this out-of-the-box solution or design an out-of-the-box solution, everybody's searching for what's the answer.
It's interesting just listening to your description there from your experience in the private energy sector and then applying that now. And it made me think of a couple of things. One, a circle back to where you said flow follows priority and intentionality. So whether that's money or the results of those things. So if you have this intentionality of diversity, which I think a lot do, but is it then a priority or not? And what are they doing to shift the model? And I did a fair bit of work a few years back with the CEO of an energy co-op in Wyoming. So they provided most of the energy for the state of Wyoming. And they were facing a similar challenge in both the workforce, innovation, how energy was generated, all sorts of succession issues. And he'd been a CEO for over 20 years at this energy co-op. And it was just fascinating to observe the transitions of their thinking, and the transitions of what could even be possible is often limited by just repeating what you had before, seeking efficiency and seeking productivity, to now going into a reimagination. And sometimes it takes a big event to give some people that permission to reimagine. So I guess going into healthcare, you had this self-permission that you get, no, I want to do it this way. This is the way I want to shift it. And then the second piece that it reminded me was the conversation I had with a chap who's been at the FBI for 25 years. And he was head of talent acquisition, and a similar challenge. How do you get people when the pre-assessment piece is hard, security checks hard, and then trying to get on the same line, diversity and capability, right? And a real challenge. So I think this is so relevant to so many companies and organizations, is their talent pipeline that has the right, quality, but also the adaptability for what skills are going to be required next. If we have 30 million programmers currently employed today, maybe in 5 years' time, we'll only have 1 million, because we'll interact with generative AI and that will program for us. Within healthcare, we have allied workers, and then we have all of these other technologies that are shifting how allied workers function, and what some of their roles and responsibilities will be. So I'm curious of two things, Van, that I want to dive into. One is all of that narrative. What were some of the actual elements of that playbook to go from, low levels of diversity, struggling pipeline, to getting it there? What were some of those steps that an organization is going, yeah, they're nodding their head, yeah, give me the detail, of those. Give us a few headline details. And then the second part is, what are you envisaging for the next few years? What are you working on to ensure that continues in terms of the relevancy of pipeline? So there's two parts to that question. What have you done so far that people can replicate, and what do they need to think of in terms of to make it still relevant as it moves forward?
Well, Ross, I'm glad you asked these. And one of the positives of the pandemic was I actually was able to write down some of these lessons learned, these best practices in my book, Workforce RX. So, one of the things I discussed is sort of the myth or the perception that most companies have to go at it themselves when they're struggling with persistent workforce shortages. And, do you build or buy really is the question. And what a big lesson learned is that workforce development is a team sport, not an individual sport. And especially in the allied health worker, where you're bringing in a lot of diversity, it's your entry level occupations is a fantastic place to do that work. And so, what does it mean when it's a team sport? What are you trying to solve? So, if employers want to have day one ready employees or candidates, you have to develop that talent pool. And so, when you have persistent shortage, what I would call that is a talent puddle, right? So we have the problem of the fire hose and the garden hose when it comes to the mismatch between what employers want and what education institutions want to do, right? So, think about all of us as employers, we like drip out jobs. Here's one job, here's two jobs, maybe three jobs, maybe at most like five of the same jobs. Well, that is so uninteresting to higher education because they have an economy of scale too. They need to have at least 25 students, and when you're dwindling down to 15, that means your class is going to get canceled, right? So so I would call what's going on in the higher education is it's like a fire hose. It needs to have a volume of students, and they all gush out like 25 students at a time in May, right? Whereas our jobs as employers, they just drip out like a garden hose. So to correct this mismatch, really, what we have to do is form consortium. And what we're trying to do is aggregate jobs. So if you're the employer, it will be helpful if you take a look at your supply chain, right? You have supplier partners who may hire similar occupations, like maybe 80% the same. You may have adjacent industries. For us, we were the energy industry, but there were the tree trimmers who climb poles. That was very similar to our line workers, for example. So you could borrow from adjacent industries. And then the most interesting, and this is the most difficult for healthcare because they're so competitive, is to actually play with your competitors. Now, I tell employers, really, when you have a talent puddle, collaborate to create the talent pool, and the point of competition is actually at the hiring, right? Because otherwise you're just fishing from a very, very shallow pool. So one rule of thumb in this playbook, when you're really struggling from persistent workforce shortages, is play together as a team. And then what you do is you begin to combine resources. We all do what we do best. We all bring some resources to the table. We don't have to do it all. And this formula always works. So you aggregate the employers, then it better matches the interests of the education institution. There is a third party, set of parties involved, and to do the outreach and case management of candidates, because education and even the application process for companies, it's a very, very difficult process to go through. So all that, the coaching, the hand-holding, case management, what I call it, of candidates through this whole process often requires a third set of parties, which could either be your community organizations or a system called the workforce boards. And so when the three come together, I call it the three-legged stool, then you have the right team to be able to do workforce development and break your downward cycle. Now, Ross, I would say if you can post your job and get what you want, then don't do this, because it does take intentionality and commitment. But if you know you have a structural issue, like 25% to 50%, retirement, or in the healthcare world, 85% of care facilities are experiencing shortages in allied health worker, and this is every state,
And many
then we have a
countries.
problem. Right? You can't just
countries.
steal from each other.
Yeah.
Right. Some entities will have to start seeding the work in order to break the cycle.
And it's interesting because here in the UK, we have a very interesting dynamic of mass strikes going on right now in so many different sectors and areas. So some of the biggest strikes in history across some of our healthcare, NHS, some across the postal services, rail services, all of these sorts of things. So you have a backdrop of that challenge. You have a backdrop here of exiting from the EU, then changing the dynamics of workforces and workability and visas and all of those kind of challenges, again, very relevant to healthcare. And so you have sort of multiple aspects of the employee life cycle, right, that you're talking about, from this talent puddle to being a talent pool. How do you get them in? How do you then retain them and then, develop them? And of course, you've got to deal with the succession in the full scope. And it takes, I think, quite a paradigm shift for people to go from, I'm a competitive company and all of my stuff is my IP, my secrets, my thing, and I don't play well with others, to perhaps where you've had a beautiful experience from community colleges, from nonprofit, from all of these, where we've got the same do what matters mission at the top. We'll all come. We might have diversity. We might argue for a few weeks beforehand and point blame, but ultimately we are designed as a system to play well together in all the boats rising. But in private sector, often that's very difficult to shift your mind, the mental gymnastics, to go from, oh, my three competitors and all of these, let's go and, pool resources. Let's go and work on the talent pool together. Let's go and reimagine how the education is so that they come more ready for us. And I think that is one challenge, the shift from everything I've done before is about protecting my competitive advantage to now you're telling me play with others. And I think the second part, which is interesting, one of our organizations we work with is one of the largest construction and engineering architecture firms in the US, and they're doing a lot of acquisitions. So they do 5 or 6 acquisitions a year, growing their workforce quite substantially in that process. And they're also onboarding sort of 50 to 100 apprentices, students each year that go through the flow that they feel education hasn't done enough for them. So we've got to do the program as a private company to get them properly prepared. Correct. And so this challenge of this educational gap of, oh, we'll teach you, then you go and work, versus no, you're doing it in real time, work and learn perpetually, that I need this, I'll learn it. I need this, I'll learn it. What's your thoughts on those two things? One, paradigm shift of going from competition to collaboration when it's not the normal playbook. And the second, the evolution of how education is going from you do it in a time and moment to then go and apply it, versus a continual cycle that the responsibility of employer is not to just extract that value, but to actually educate, train, and develop now.
Well, I just came back from an event I was the keynote, and it was a gathering of all of these healthcare organizations across the country. And they're all trying to do good, right? And they were coming together for policy and advocacy. Well, the CEO of the organization said, is it a matter of better marketing? Is it that we need to better market healthcare jobs and then steal them from others, from other industries? Or is there something bigger going on? I mean, we actually have a structural issue going on right now, right? So it's not just marketing the healthcare jobs. What we're experiencing is that even traditional pipelines are not going to be reliable. And what I mean is that, if you're normally bringing workers, hiring workers from the sort of the K-12 and the college pipeline, the K-12 population, the kindergarten to 12th grade population in our country, secondary school, is actually flatlining and shrinking. So it's going down. And then during the pandemic, the enrollment in higher education went down dramatically. So, roughly about, 5%, a little bit more now in the 4 years, all the 4-year universities and colleges. And then in the 2-year colleges, it's been dramatic, like in the close to 20%, which is a great loss of students. So when you think about the shrinking pipeline at the beginning, and then of course you have the exiting baby boomers who take all of their experience with them, going, then what you have left is really adults, right? And then you have to cast the net wider in terms of rural areas and underserved communities to bring populations that would not have considered these jobs to begin coming in. So it's an extraordinary amount of work for any one company to take on, and it's best done in a consortium approach. So I remember when I was doing workforce development in the energy sector, my industry rallied and began to organize state by state, and this is another playbook. So within your geographies, you're going to play together. So they said, well, can you contact your other peers and form a consortium? I didn't even know who they were, right? So I just had our CEO communicate to the other CEO to designate someone, and all the someones came together. We borrowed the charter from the national organization, and boom, we had a consortium. Then the colleges were willing to play, and they said, well, if you could agree, you employers, if you could agree on one curriculum, one occupation that you want, we'll fund it, and so that it can get built. And so my work was to get all of us to agree, and we did. And then education did build what we wanted. So again, there's some benefits. There's some solutions that you could come to because you play together that you just can't do alone. Remind me, Ross, what is the second question?
It's gone from my mind, and it doesn't matter because I'm loving where we're going with this. And I think the challenge then of, we see the advantages of consortiums and the idea of that we can do more together. And on the flip side of it is, well, how do any decisions get made when you've got all different voices, different thoughts, different personalities, different politics, different elements that exist within that it is a unique skill to deal with that whole how do you play well together on the playground situation, and so that's an interesting one. But I wanted to touch on, have you come across the team at Startup Health, Steve Krein and Unity Stokes at Startup Health?
No, tell me more.
I definitely need to introduce you to them. I thought you might have, because they were heavily endorsed during the Obama administration. Think Y Combinator for healthcare startups. Okay. They've got now about, I think, maybe 400, 500 companies in their portfolio. And they operate under 12 health moonshots. And so those are your what matters, orbiting around a health moonshot. So it might be about cost to zero, or universal access, or mental health and happiness, whatever the moonshot elements would be. And then there's the pocket acting as a consortium of startups at different stages, right? Some have exited and are doing, big pieces. I think it's a few billion funds under management in and around that orbit this entity. But I'll definitely, because they're mainly US based, whilst they do have geographies. We're part of the Startup Health portfolio, so we're a portfolio company of theirs, which is why I know a fair bit about them. I also know Steve Krein and Unity Stokes, who are the founders, quite well. They founded it maybe 12, 13 years ago. And I just thinking about what you're doing at Futuro could be really aligned with a lot of the work and activity that they're doing about policy change, policy shift, and doing things at scale, and this collaboration between people and technology to do good things. So I think that would be interesting. And I didn't want to forget it while you were.
Oh, that'd be a wonderful
challenges.
conversation, because what they already have is the constellation of employers.
Yes.
Remember? So the
You've got it.
consortium. So when you have the employers, then you can begin aggregating, and then create what Futuro Health does is we're creating custom education journeys so that communities can find these jobs, right? So
I think that could be really fascinating little connection. Yeah, we'll get that set up. We'll get that set up.
Oh,
so
wonderful.
The other piece did we touch on some practical steps? I think we did touch on a few practical steps for them to start to take it from this idea and this paradigm shift of how do you play well together. I think that was perhaps some of the other second part. But as we come to the final piece, a question that I ask all of my guests, Van, is around curiosity. And it's sort of this mix between unlearning, which is one of our dimensions. How can we let go of past behaviors, knowledge, or processes that have served us before that are now gone from a springboard to actually now a ball and chain that are holding us back? How do we intentionally let go of those to allow for new breakthroughs and new opportunities? And they're kind of linked, this curiosity, doing things for the first time. And what we've noticed in a number of my research pieces and conversations on this podcast is how curiosity and creativity is bashed out of us, and society and life bashes it out of us from when we're kids. We see a wall, we'll scribble on it. We don't know that that's not the right thing to do. And then by the time we're at work, our creativity is so spent, and we don't often stretch those boundaries. My question is, when was the last time you did something for the first time, and what was it, Van?
All right. Before I share that example, I do want to acknowledge, it's my ability to be creative and is really also tied to my ability to take risk. And one of the things that really sucks the life out of you is if you have a lot of loans. So, make sure that you have the ability to take risks, because otherwise that risk is scary. If it's, you have the potential to, jeopardize your job or your 401k or any of that, that makes you much more conservative. So fortunately, I've been able to test the boundaries of workforce development and learn new best practices and how they combine it across private sector, public sector, and now nonprofit. And it is because I have some ability to take risk, and that unleashes, my creativity. So what have I tried that is completely brand new? I think at this stage of life, you tend to do things where you already have mastery, right? Or close to mastery, but so I decided I was going to try something that was completely far off, but it also to try out a different hobby. And what I love is I do music. I have like 12 years of classical music in my background. Not that I've used it, but how do I combine music with my need for exercise? So I saw some flyers on taiko drum. It's like a Japanese art. It's like these giant drums. So I went there for at the Parks and Rec Center, and I started beating up the drums, and it was so much fun. So I might give it a try.
I love it. I love that. Drums have come into my world a couple of times recently. My co-founder, Mike, every month does a drum ceremony at the moon changing in the forest, which is really cool with a community. And my nan, about maybe 2 months ago, we saw a piece on our local news about a dance community for Parkinson's sufferers. And we were trying to encourage her to do more things, do some different things. She's very conscious. And she went with my mum. And as a finale, they did a drum ceremony finale, so different for them. And just the act of doing things with others that you might not have done, or maybe many of them haven't done before, how freeing that is, that something that's perceived risky, that if you do it in a group of others, it can kind of lessen that blow of risk in your own mind, that, oh, I'm not in a room of others with mastery, I'm in a room with others that are figuring it out as we go. And
Ross, there's a conundrum I think many of your listeners may have faced. It's like, once you've had some success, the fear of failure is actually much greater. You would think, oh, success, I'll just get more success. But actually, oh, what if I mess up my record?
Yeah.
And, that was a conundrum that I faced. And a group called Catalyst Constellation, they work with a lot of people, like myself and your listeners who are activators. We come up with ideas, and we make them come to life. And went to a 1.5-day retreat. And it was interesting what by the end, we had drawn this map of what we wanted to do. And I realized, gosh, I have no energy, because that is what I'm expected to do. Whereas, and it closed off my option, right? So it reflected all the risk and concerns I had about myself. And once I realized what was happening, then all of a sudden my aperture opened, and I was willing to take on a new venture like Futuro Health, really to solve a big problem. Like, if a friend said, if we're not taking on this big problem, then who will? So I was willing to take the risk of failure as well. But fortunately, what has come to fruition is that we've now proven some new solutions and best practices that can help all of our communities.
I think it's that willingness to try, and the gap between expectation and capability. And a great piece that my coach I mentioned before, Dan Sullivan, he has the 4 C's. And when we create anything, and it's about commitment, if we're making a commitment to something that we don't have the capability of yet, we need courage. So if we stay in our zone, well, actually, we're just staying in our zone. We don't need courage for it. So to grow to something that's new, making a commitment, we need courage. Then we'll get the capability, and it will increase our confidence. So we can make a new commitment that's new and different. And I think it's that balance, isn't it, between an expectation, past performance, oh, it really matters, or it's a big problem. We put this expectation and pressure on that for some are the fire, for others are the crumble. And it's just negotiating and navigating that balance for each individual to know what's going to create, the outcomes that we want, where we maintain positive mental health, not an outcome, but actually I've become ill and sick to generate that outcome.
4 C's. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah. All right. So if people want to get in touch with you, if they've been inspired by some of your thinking or want to learn more about Futuro, how do they best get in touch, Van?
The easiest way is if you could just Google Futuro Health, and it's like future, but with an O in the end instead of the E. futurohealth.org you can find me there. And then also you can find me on LinkedIn. As well as on Amazon. My book is available there, and all the proceeds are being donated to the nonprofit work of Futuro Health.
Wonderful. That's Workforce RX. We'll add a lot of these links into the show notes for those who are listening. Thank you, Van. It's been an absolute pleasure to hang out together, and I've learned a lot, and I can't wait to connect you up with Steve and Unity at Startup Health.
Thank you, Ross. This was extremely fun.
Do you have the level of adaptability to survive and thrive the rapid changes ahead? Has your resilience got more comeback than a yo-yo? Do you have the ability to unlearn in order to reskill, upskill and break through? Find out today and uncover your adaptability profile and score, your AQ. Visit AQai.io to gain your personalized report across 15 scientifically validated dimensions of adaptability. For a limited time, enter code PODCAST65 for a complimentary AQME assessment. AQai, transforming the way people, teams, and organizations navigate change. Thank you for listening to this episode of Decoding AQ. Please make sure you subscribe on your favourite podcast directory, and we'd love to hear your feedback. Please do leave a review and be sure to tune in next time for more insights from our amazing guests.